The self-proclaimed president of Belarus, Lukashenko, gave an interview to Russian propagandists in Bishkek and essentially used this opportunity to address the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. And this time it wasn't with advice, but rather in an almost ultimatum-like form. First, he praised that plan, whether it's the one with 28 or 19 points, in short, the first version of the peace plan from Dmitriev. He said that there is nothing impossible in it and that Ukraine must agree to it. Otherwise, there will be problems with access to the Black Sea. Here is that excerpt. Friends, please try to listen to it. Judge for yourselves.
Somewhere you can't agree on something, but I didn't see any question there that couldn't be resolved, that you couldn't come to an agreement on any issue. But if suddenly, well, there's some kind of earthquake zone, some pieces here and there, Donbas. Well, leave that for later. Well, leave that for later. Just stop the war where it's not your children dying, but other people's children. That's the main problem with Zelensky as well. Other people are dying. You have to take that into account. And most importantly, you will lose the country. If it's true what they say, that somewhere earlier, somewhere you bought something else, of course, you'll find a place to live. For your life, your children, Lena, your wife, and so on. You'll even find one for your parents. But what will Ukrainians do? Millions of people. So think about it, considering the real situation, how to preserve what you have. Because you have everything, access to the sea, Odesa is yours, Mykolaiv too, but all of this could be gone in an instant, in a single moment.
Well, let's consider what assessment can be given in principle to this address to Volodymyr Zelensky from Lukashenko. First of all, Lukashenko is a bit mistaken in thinking that Volodymyr Zelensky is a great authoritarian leader, right? Yes, who in fact lives in a paradigm similar to that of Lukashenko or Putin. That's absolutely not the case. No, Volodymyr Zelensky is fighting for Ukrainian sovereignty. He is fulfilling this duty as the guarantor of the constitution. That's the first immediate assessment of this excerpt. The second point, you could lose everything. Odesa, Mykolaiv, access to the Black Sea. Well, it's no secret to anyone that the Black Sea ports, and in fact the Black Sea coastline, this access to the sea, has been a target of the Russian Federation, a goal that has not changed since 2014. If Lukashenko wants to scare someone with this kind of rhetoric, he's not really saying anything new here. At most, he's just creating, let's say, a mood that reinforces it. The Russian negotiating position, or more precisely, the Russian ultimatum. And this position clearly fits into the program that was prepared for Ukraine in Moscow in Miami by Vitkov and Dmitry. What is it? I'll explain further and you'll understand everything. Lukashenko is now carrying out an order, a specific informational order from the Kremlin. But not only the Kremlin, he's also carrying out an order from Washington. Unfortunately, that's the reality and that's the impression one gets. Otherwise, he wouldn't have started going point by point through the difficult issues that are written down. Well, I don't like the word capitulation in bad, potentially peace terms for Ukraine. Another excerpt concerns the army of 600 or 800,000. We're talking about the armed forces. Let's give an assessment of this once again.
The proposal is for a 600,000 strong army. The Europeans want 800,000. Goodness, you need to maintain an army of 600,000. The Poles today, and they're a stronger economic country, have 200,000. Well, they want more over there. 200, 800,000, can you imagine? Russia, a huge country, has almost that many in its army. So they're just grasping at whatever they can. So the issue isn't about signing this peace treaty project from the Europeans' point of view. The thing is, they don't want this peace. They just don't understand why they need the war.
Now, let me explain why Lukashenko is actually carrying out the orders not only of Moscow, but also of Washington. Look, Reuters published a piece today saying that the Trump administration is fundamentally and essentially working on a release. We're talking about Belarusian prisoners, prisoners in Belarus, specifically political prisoners. And this isn't the first round of such releases. This has been happening in recent months. You know that Washington has ideas. It's not just an idea. It's a concrete program, a plan laid out with specific dates for opening a consulate and accordingly an embassy in Belarus. Further steps might involve bigger moves like visas and so on. So all of this is happening. Trump, for some reason sees the Belarusians as negotiators who are capable of putting pressure on Vladimir Putin. But here the question is, who is actually putting pressure on whom? Vitkov is obviously also familiar with Lukashenko, and quite well too. And this also fits into this whole story, which unfortunately I didn't believe it until the very end, but it seems to be true that this plan was actually perhaps not written in Washington. It may have been adjusted there, but it was probably definitely not written there. Since there is a shared history with political prisoners, a shared history with the reopening of the embassy, and now Lukashenko's speech, it just takes on a completely different tone. And it's not just a speech, it's a big 10 to 15-minute interview for Russian propagandists. Now, another story. Driscoll, as we know, is the US Secretary of the Army. You can see him in this photo. If you count from left to right, he's the fourth one. This is Driscoll. This is the closest friend and ally of US Vice President Vance, his right-hand man, who, as Ushakov said yesterday, was the piano in the bushes. The piano in the bushes is actually for Ukraine as well, not just for the Russian Federation. Why? Because this is a new person on the negotiation team who is stirring things up a bit, so to speak. So we have a Secretary of State who keeps everything under control, through whom everything goes. And now Driscoll is becoming a kind of bridge between Moscow and Kyiv and Washington, but not Brussels. Still, Rubio is responsible for Brussels and the European Union and their position. What has been achieved now is that the plan, which is being developed in three centers, Kyiv, Washington, and Brussels, is unified. This is thanks to Rubio, who brought this track back. But the Driscoll factor is quite complicated here. And so when Lukashenko, let's connect these things now, tries to intimidate on behalf of Putin, of course, but not only, I repeat, not only on behalf of Putin, threatens that Ukraine could lose Odesa and Mykolaiv if it does not agree to the peace plan currently being proposed, and that things will only get worse with the loss of more territory. And Driscoll, in turn, adds fuel to the fire. And at a closed meeting, this is reported by the New York Times, at a closed meeting in Kyiv, he spoke about the enormous potential of the Russian Federation in terms of missile production. And there are so many of these missiles that they could destroy everything in the world and bring Ukraine to very quickly a real capitulation. So Driscoll says, let's end this war as soon as possible on the terms that exist now so that things don't get worse. Because, in fact, the world and the United States probably have no hope of standing up to the Russian military-industrial complex. But it seems to me that this logic is a bit flawed. Why? Because if missiles are accumulating in the Russian Federation at a crazy pace, they will continue to accumulate even faster if some of these missiles stop being used in this war. The point is not to stop the flight of the missiles. The point is to actually stop the production of these missiles. And that's why Driscoll should be making statements of that kind, not the ones he's making now, which basically echo Lukashenko or say something very similar. Next, Rubio. This is already the publication Politico. Rubio spoke with journalists and put forward a rather complicated story at the moment. I just can't understand one thing. If the United States doesn't want to complicate things, if they don't want Kyiv and Brussels to make any adjustments, then why are they reinventing the wheel themselves and starting to adjust the fresh peace plan on the fly? Well, on a global scale, right? Rubio says that the United States wants to first conclude a peace agreement and only then separately deal with security guarantees. In other words, security guarantees would be a separate agreement between Washington and Ukraine. So this should not be included in the peace plan. I don't know. It seems to me these are some new circumstances that also, for some reason, fit into this line of pressure. Lukashenko, who is relaying a message from Putin, and obviously from Vitkov, if not from Trump. Driscoll, who says that if the war isn't stopped now, missiles will start flying all over Europe. And Rubio, who says we shouldn't provoke the Russian Federation, that security guarantees, weapons, and so on, all that is separate. But first, let's stop all of this. And why, for example, Volodymyr Zelensky is standing his ground. That's the word used by journalists from The Atlantic in particular. There's a specific author here, Simon Schuster, a respected American journalist who wrote a major article for The Atlantic. And, you know, it's very interesting. Simon Schuster explains Volodymyr Zelensky's motivation. For example, that Zelensky is actually not wants to resolve the territorial issue, which is a red line for Kyiv, in order to end the war and not lose the upcoming elections. So now this information has been digested. In other words, Schuster writes that Zelensky promised Donald Trump that the armed forces of Ukraine would be able to encircle Russian troops around Pokrovsk and that this would happen by October of this year. Obviously, we can see that this did not happen, and that's why Schuster writes Trump's mood is as it is. It changed, and for this very reason, Washington and Moscow, with the participation of Vitkov and Dmitriev, began developing this 28-point plan. Next comes a quote from an unnamed close aide to the president of Ukraine. If he gives up even 1 square kilometer, that will become the main issue in any election. Any opponent will keep hammering him for it until he breaks. Right now, I find it very, very interesting that the issue of elections is being raised in such reputable publications as The Atlantic and by such a respected journalist as Simon Schuster. So obviously, this is some kind of inseparable process that we are not giving enough consideration to right now. Everyone is talking about the peace plan, but no one is talking about the elections. If, in fact, the president's office in Kyiv is thinking about elections while defending the Ukrainian agenda in the points of the peace plan, this situation is wrong. My personal opinion, once again going back to the beginning, is that Volodymyr Zelensky is the guarantor of the constitution, who is currently the acting, legitimate, and fully authorized president of Ukraine. He must safeguard Ukrainian sovereignty without exception, regardless of the outcome of the elections, which may be strongly and persistently demanded in the context of concluding a peace agreement. And it is very unfortunate if the only motivation to hold, for example, the city of Pokrovsk is simply electoral expectations. Personally, I do not believe that is the case. But The Atlantic now forces, well, I don't know, some people to doubt what is really happening.